"You're out of the inheritance," my grandchild gloated. At the reading, the lawyer turned to her and said, "That sentence. It's the truth, but it's not the whole story. I'm Vivian Sterling. I've lived 82 years on this earth, and I thought I had seen it all. Stock market crashes, the dawn of the internet, losing the love of my life, George. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the venom in the eyes of my own grandson. They say you become invisible when you get older. They stop seeing the woman who ran a home, raised 3 children, and stood shoulder to shoulder with a titan of industry as he built a tech empire from the ground up. They just see a frail woman who needs a little help. What they don't see is the steel that forged the Sterling name. When George died 6 years ago, I didn't crumble. I took the reins of the family foundation, managed a portfolio that could rival a small country's GDP, and kept the legacy safe. We're talking about a $5 million estate, much of it tied up in that beautiful Malibu summer house and the stock fund George and I built from scratch. For decades, I was the quiet power, the discreet matriarch. And then, the wolves came calling. It started so innocently. Caleb and his fiancée, Brittany, suddenly decided they needed to check in on Grandma every week. They'd sit in my living room, all expensive clothes and forced smiles, talking about their tough life in New York, subtly letting me know how much they were struggling. I knew what they wanted, of course. I'm old, not stupid, but I never imagined the depths they would sink to, or that they would use my age against me as a weapon. They came for my money. They came for my dignity. They came for the life George and I built. And for a moment, I let them think they had won. If you've ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated, then you'll understand why I need to tell you this story. This isn't just about money. It's about respect. It's about the fact that wisdom doesn't just vanish when you hit 80, it deepens. I'm going to tell you the whole truth, from the first lie they told me, to the moment the lawyer turned to my grandson and gave him the shock of his life. I know this is a long story, but stick with me. I promise you, the ending is worth it. And if you've ever heard a tale of a strong woman fighting back, please do me a favor and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of my truth. I need you here for this. You know, there's a difference between a grandchild needing a few dollars and a grandchild smelling blood in the water. Caleb and Brittany's visits, which started out as family time, quickly became tiresome, almost like clockwork. They'd hover, asking about my health, about my schedule, and always about the family assets. The first real chill ran through me the afternoon Caleb brought up the Elizabeth diamond necklace. George gave it to me on our 50th wedding anniversary. It's a significant piece, yes, but for me, it was George's love, a promise of forever wrapped in platinum and shine. Caleb's tone was so casual when he asked where I kept it, mentioning that maybe I should have it reappraised for insurance purposes. Insurance. Right. Like I haven't been managing insurance on priceless items for 60 years. I gave him a knowing smile, the kind that only grandmothers can perfect. Sweet on the surface, iron underneath, and told him I'd lent it to the Sterling Foundation for a special exhibition. A strategic lie, a little test. I watched Brittany's face fall. It was like watching a child lose their favorite toy. The disappointment was too raw, too undisguised to be about anything but money. That's when I knew. They weren't just hopeful, they were calculating, they were taking inventory. But the real soul-shaking betrayal came a week later when my middle son, Andrew, called. Andrew has always been a decent man, if a little naive and distracted by his own affairs. He told me that Caleb and Brittany were very worried about my ability to protect the portfolio. He said they were suggesting I needed help reviewing the wills and perhaps assistance with large financial decisions. Andrew's voice was full of that patronizing pity that makes my skin crawl. He kept using words like confused and saying I was remembering things wrong. He even had the gall to tell me that in this new world of fintech and digital assets, I might not be up to speed and that I was vulnerable to fraud. Fraud? From whom, I wondered. The only fraud I could see was him repeating his grandson's prepared script to his own mother. I hung up the phone and sat there, the weight of 82 years suddenly pressing down on me. My heart ached, not from a medical condition, but from a familial wound. They were laying the groundwork. They weren't just after the inheritance. They were after my competence. They needed to prove I was senile to get what they wanted. And then, a memory clicked. A detail that suddenly shone a light on the whole scheme. About a month prior, George's lifelong accountant, Bernard Finch, had finally retired. It was Caleb, wasn't it, who had been pushing me relentlessly to hire a young fintech expert he supposedly knew? A whiz kid, he called him, who could modernize the books. I remember feeling a slight hesitation at the time, but Caleb had been so charming, so persistent. That was the crack. The expert wasn't an advisor, he was their mole. I went straight to my home office. It's funny the things young people assume. They see a slightly shaky hand and a woman who prefers paper checks to apps, and they think you've forgotten how to think. They assume you haven't been an active partner to one of the most successful, tech-savvy men of his generation. What they didn't know was that George, bless his soul, taught me everything. He even set up a secure, encrypted system for our most sensitive files, a system he knew only I would understand how to use. He always said, "Vivian, trust your gut and trust your encryption." I decided to bypass Caleb's expert entirely. I reached out to Loretta Davies, Bernard's assistant. Loretta had worked with George for 20 years, a quiet woman with a mind for numbers and an unparalleled sense of loyalty. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. I just asked her for a quiet favor, a confidential double-check on the work the new expert had been doing. I told her I was just being a cautious old woman. Loretta's first report, delivered discreetly to me, not to the main office, was enough to turn my blood cold. The young expert wasn't making simple mistakes. He was setting up a systematic, slow leak. Caleb had opened a series of shell corporations, small, untraceable holding companies. He was already trying to gain remote access to my actual investment files, the ones that held the real wealth, not just the house. It wasn't paranoia, you see. It was a real, tangible threat, a carefully laid plan. They planned to drain me, sell my home, and then use my perceived technological inability to claim temporary guardianship over my assets. They thought I was a museum piece, pretty to look at, but easily discarded. They were about to learn that sometimes the oldest machines are the best maintained. They think I'm just confused. They think I don't see the little pieces moving on the chessboard. I know exactly what they're trying to do, and that means the game has changed. The moment I realized their plan was real, the sadness vanished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. When you reach my age, you learn that life is less about grand gestures and more about patient, meticulous detail. They were focused on the shiny new digital world. I decided to return to the forgotten art of observation and paperwork. They thought they had isolated me. They had convinced Andrew and others that I was too overwhelmed to manage the Sterling Foundation and should step back. So, I stepped back, right into my private library, a place Caleb hadn't stepped foot in since he was 10. It was dusty, full of George's first engineering sketches, old photo albums, and most importantly, decades of meticulous financial records on paper. Young people believe that if something isn't on the cloud, it doesn't exist. They were looking for digital footprints, but the real history, the real power, was locked in my safe, secured by an old combination lock only George and I knew. I called Loretta Davies again, the trusted accountant. I didn't mince words this time. I told her I believed Caleb was stealing, and that I needed her to act as my private detective. She didn't hesitate. She told me she always knew George's new fintech expert felt slimy. Loretta's work was astonishingly quick. She found that the shell corporations Caleb had created were actually conduits. He wasn't just siphoning dividends. He was trying to use those shell companies as a facade to secure large, short-term loans. The final damning detail she uncovered was that he was preparing paperwork to use my beloved Malibu summer house as collateral for a $300 $100 personal loan. He intended to pay off some of his New York debts, sell the house quickly under the guise of simplifying the estate, and pocket the difference after paying back the loan. It was aggressive, messy, and sickeningly selfish. That Malibu house wasn't just property. It was where George and I renewed our vows, where my deceased daughter, Sarah, spent her last happy summer. It was sacred ground, and he was treating it like a quickly flipping asset. The betrayal was deeper than greed, though. It was a profound disrespect. They viewed my life, my memories, and George's legacy as nothing more than a giant ATM. Andrew, too, by his inaction and by parroting their concerns, was complicit in the belief that I was a liability to be managed. He kept telling me, "It's for your own good, Mom. We need to streamline things." Every time he used that word, I saw dollar signs in his eyes, not concern. My grief began to harden into a fierce, protective instinct. I remembered something George used to say to me back in the early days of our business, when we were facing ruthless competitors. "Vivian, never show your hand until you're holding the royal flush." I realized I had to play their game, but better. My first act of counterintelligence was subtle. When Caleb and Brittany visited next, I played the part they wrote for me. I wore my softest cardigan. I complained about the weather. I confused Caleb with Andrew once or twice. Brittany, bless her ambitious little heart, leaned in and patted my hand, telling me in a loud, slow voice that everything was going to be just fine and that they would handle all the paperwork. It was like slipping on an old, comfortable mask. They saw fragility, not focus. They saw a woman ready to fade away, not a chess master planning her final move. They were so confident in my supposed senility that they made a fatal mistake. They stopped hiding their intentions from me. They thought any little snippet I heard would be instantly forgotten. I remember Caleb talking to Brittany on his phone, right outside my hearing aids range, but not my ears. He spoke about scheduling a medical review and mentioned the term temporary guardianship. He said the doctor they were bringing in was a friend of a friend and would confirm my recent memory lapses. The sound of his voice, confident and cold, was the last thing I needed to hear. They weren't waiting for me to pass away. They were actively trying to erase me. They were seeking a court order to declare me mentally incompetent, thereby seizing control of everything George and I built. The pain of that realization was staggering, but it ignited a fire I hadn't felt since I was a young woman fighting for my place in a man's world. They think I'm just a helpless old woman, a gentle memory waiting to expire. They are about to learn otherwise. They are about to realize that you never, ever cross a sterling matriarch when she is protecting her own. Playing the part of the fading matriarch was surprisingly easy and sickeningly effective. For 82 years, I've managed expectations, first as George's wife, then as the community's pillar, and finally as the grieving widow. This role of the confused grandma was just another mask, but this one gave me power because it made my enemies blind. They had scheduled a visit with the doctor, the one Caleb had arranged, who had never seen me before. Before the appointment, Caleb and Brittany came over to prepare me. Brittany smoothed my dress and spoke to me with exaggerated patience, explaining that the doctor was just coming to talk about vitamin levels and my general well-being. I looked at her with wide, slightly vacant eyes, nodded slowly, and asked if her mother was doing well, even though I knew perfectly well that her mother had passed 3 years ago. The brief flash of irritation and disdain in Brittany's eyes was priceless. It confirmed they believed the act. When the doctor arrived, he was young, sharp, and had that detached look of someone paid to perform a service, not to care. I answered his questions slowly, sometimes drifting off topic to talk about George's pet project from the 1970s, or confusing the year he was asking about with a date from World War II. I let my hands tremble a little when I picked up my teacup. I even repeated myself several times, ending each thought with a gentle, "But what was the question again, dear?" Caleb, who sat beside me, kept correcting me gently, patting my arm and assuring the doctor that my memory had been worse lately. He told the doctor I was having trouble managing the simplest things, that I had been forgetting to pay bills, a blatant, calculated lie. The doctor scribbled notes, his expression confirming what they wanted. I was slipping. The real gold, though, came immediately after the examination. The doctor stepped outside with Caleb to discuss the next steps, leaving Brittany to help me back to my chair. She thought I was too tired, too out of it, to listen. I heard the doctor tell Caleb that the paperwork for the temporary conservatorship could be filed within the week based on the evidence of my cognitive decline. He told Caleb that using the Malibu property as collateral would be much easier once the courts approved the conservatorship, because then Caleb would have the power to sign all the legal documents. While I was listening to this, Brittany was straightening a misplaced photograph of my daughter, Sarah. She leaned in, not realizing how close she was to my good ear, and muttered to Caleb on the phone, who was still outside. "Hurry up with the doctor. I need to talk to you about the lawyer. She actually thinks the necklace is on display at the foundation. Can you believe how far gone she is?" I flinched internally, but outwardly, I just smiled blandly and asked her if she'd like another cup of tea. She looked at me, a mixture of triumph and utter contempt in her expression, and just waved her hand dismissively, saying she needed to go. The cruelty of it, mocking my memory of the priceless necklace, using my daughter's picture as a prop while discussing stealing her inheritance, was a deep, cutting insult. They were so consumed by their own cleverness and my perceived weakness that they never stopped to consider that I was listening, assessing, and calculating. They had underestimated me because I am old. They saw me as a relic of a bygone era, technologically inept and mentally frail. They assumed that the generation who invented the computer, navigated the Cold War, and built fortunes from grit and intuition somehow lost all capacity for strategy simply by reaching 80. They've signed my supposed death warrant, giving themselves a deadline of within the week to finalize the theft. They told me everything I needed to know because they thought their words would simply fall into the void of an old woman's confusion. But I remember every word. And now, I have the date and the method of their final attack. Their biggest mistake wasn't underestimating my wealth. It was underestimating the cunning that keeps that wealth protected. With the doctor's visit complete and their timeline established, filing the conservatorship within the week, I knew my window was closing fast. It was time to stop playing the confused grandmother and start acting like the partner of a late-stage capitalist titan. Caleb's immediate debt was the fuse, but I realized the deeper motivation was pure, corrosive impatience. He wasn't willing to build his own fortune. He just wanted to inherit George's right now. He saw my continued management of the estate, my very existence, as an obstacle. He wanted the legacy without the effort, the money without the wisdom that created it. I tasked Loretta Davies with a more comprehensive investigation into Caleb's background. Not just his shell companies, but his recent career moves, his social circles, and most importantly, his relationship with his father, Andrew. What Loretta found confirmed my darkest suspicions about the arrogance of the younger generation. Caleb hadn't just been struggling with debt. He had been involved in several failed startups, using his privileged name to secure funding he quickly squandered. He was an entitled disappointment. Loretta reported that he had recently been overheard at a New York gathering complaining bitterly about the old guard holding on to resources. He had claimed that George's carefully structured foundation was inefficient and that the Malibu house was dead capital that needed to be unlocked immediately. He didn't respect the fact that George and I built that wealth over 60 years of relentless work and careful investment. He saw it as his birthright, a lottery ticket he was just waiting for me to hand over. The most painful discovery was Andrew's role. Loretta found emails between Caleb and Andrew. Andrew wasn't actively plotting the fraud, but he wasn't stopping it either. He had written to Caleb that he was tired of waiting for his share and that Mom's traditional ways were stifling the estate's growth. He had signed off on the notion that if the wealth wasn't growing at a frantic, unrealistic pace, it was somehow my fault, my son, my sweet, oblivious Andrew. He let his own impatience and Caleb's persuasive greed convince him that I was a burden, a weak link to be managed. He was the perfect, negligent accomplice. He convinced himself he was protecting me from myself, when in reality, he was protecting his own future share by facilitating the theft. I remembered George's face when he finished paying off that Malibu house decades ago. The sweat on his brow, the pride in his eyes. He said, "Vivian, this is security. This is for our children's peace of mind, not their pockets." Caleb and Andrew were destroying that peace for a temporary cash injection. My counterattack had to target this arrogance directly. I decided that the lesson they learned couldn't just be a legal inconvenience. It had to be a complete, public, and embarrassing destruction of the very entitlement they felt. They wanted to streamline the estate? Fine. I would streamline their expectations, permanently. I had the means to do it too. George, always the pragmatist, had taught me about the unique legal status of certain assets, especially the Malibu house. That night, alone in my study, surrounded by the ghosts of my past, I made a decisive move. I dug out the original deed for the Malibu house. Young Caleb had no idea that George and I had structured the ownership with a specific legal clause, one that bypassed the immediate inheritance rules if the property was sold before my death. George had put it in there as a fail-safe against short-sighted greed, saying, "If they only see the asset, Vivian, they don't deserve the rest." I closed the old safe and knew what I had to do. I had to sell the house, my home, immediately. Not just to spite them, but to protect the true legacy for the deserving family members, the children of my late daughter, Sarah, who had never asked for a thing. The paperwork was already in motion. I just needed the buyer to sign. And then, I would have the ultimate proof of Caleb's fraud and the perfect timing for the inevitable family confrontation he was planning. They were waiting for me to be declared incompetent. I was waiting for the final signature that would prove I was the only one in control. They say age makes you slow, but panic, or rather strategic necessity, can move mountains. Once I realized their plan centered on liquidating the Malibu house quickly after the conservatorship was granted, my objective was clear. I had to sell it before they could legally touch it. I bypassed the Sterling Foundation's usual real estate agent, the one Caleb had recently befriended, and called an old friend of George's, Mr. Henry Albright. Henry is 91 now, retired, but he still knows the Los Angeles market better than anyone. He was discreet, he was loyal to George, and he was thrilled to be involved in a high-stakes Sterling operation, as he called it. Within 72 hours, Henry had a legitimate full-price cash offer on the table from a quiet tech billionaire who wanted anonymity and a quick closing. It was a whirlwind of lawyers, documents, and secure wire transfers. George's fail-safe clause, the one Caleb knew nothing about, allowed me to execute the sale unilaterally, bypassing Andrew's involvement. The moment the funds hit the secure, encrypted trust account I had set up, I felt a physical shift. The house was gone, but the money, millions of dollars, was safe. And more importantly, it was placed where Caleb couldn't touch it. Directly into a separate fund I established for my late daughter Sarah's children. They were the ones who truly understood the value of simple things, not the price of status. Caleb and Brittany had zero access. The second crucial step in this chapter of my defense was securing an unexpected ally, my granddaughter Laura, Caleb's younger cousin. Laura is a successful software engineer and had always been uncomfortable with Caleb's aggressive financial habits. She visited me shortly after the doctor's visit, and her eyes held genuine concern, not calculation. She told me Caleb had been asking her questions about my internet usage and digital file organization. She said Caleb claimed I was vulnerable to hackers and needed her help to secure my passwords. I looked at her, truly seeing the good heart in my family, and decided it was time for a controlled reveal. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her that Caleb was trying to get a court order claiming I was senile to sell the Malibu house for his own debts. Her shock was genuine. She remembered spending her childhood summers there. I explained that I had already sold the house, legally and quietly, and put the money in a trust for her siblings. Laura's reaction was a mixture of horror and admiration. She looked at me, not as a frail old woman, but as a seasoned warrior. She told me she couldn't believe Caleb was using my age against me. Then, I told her about the final piece of George's legacy. George, who started his career in cryptography during the early internet days, had installed a unique digital monitoring system on his old network, which I still used for my personal computer. It wasn't designed to monitor me. It was designed to monitor his business. I showed Laura the hidden logs. They detailed every remote attempt Caleb's fintech expert had made to access my files. The logs showed the IP addresses, the timestamps, and the specific files they were trying to download, including copies of my will and foundation documents. They also showed the explicit data he was seeking to alter, the dividend redirection that Loretta had initially uncovered. Laura, being a cybersecurity expert herself, looked at the logs and gasped. She told me that the data was not only proof of attempted fraud, but also legally admissible evidence because George's system had been registered as a private security measure years ago. She helped me create an authenticated, time-stamped digital package of all the evidence, secured with a complex digital signature that even Caleb's expert couldn't break. The next time Caleb came over, talking about the upcoming conservatorship hearing and the need to simplify the assets, I just smiled sweetly. He kept telling me, "Grandma, you'll be much better off without the burden of that big old house." I just looked him in the eye and agreed, "Yes, Caleb, I will be much better off without the burden of that big old house." He thought I was agreeing to his plan. He had no idea that the house was no longer mine and that the proceeds were now irrevocably out of his reach. They believed I was unarmed. What they didn't know was that George and I had built my defense with decades of foresight, and I now held the key to their entire downfall. They were preparing to announce my incompetence. I was preparing to announce the biggest real estate deal of the year and the end of their criminal enterprise. With the money from the Malibu house securely in the trust for Sarah's children and the ironclad digital evidence in my possession, all that remained was timing. In life, as in business, timing is everything. If I moved too soon, they might find a way to discredit me. Too late, and the court might grant them the temporary conservatorship. They had planned the climax for me, thankfully. Andrew, under Caleb's direction, called a mandatory family meeting at the Malibu house. Caleb told Andrew it was to formally discuss the future of the estate, but I knew the truth. It was the day they planned to present the court order and the doctor's report, sealing my fate and seizing my assets. I told Andrew I would be there, naturally. I used my most fragile voice, mentioning I needed to bring my old, familiar papers because I got confused without them. This was my signal to Caleb and Brittany that I was still playing the role, reinforcing their belief that I was easily manipulated and unprepared. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon. My focus shifted to observing the dynamics between Caleb, Brittany, and Andrew. Loyalty built on greed is always fragile, and I started noticing the subtle cracks. Loretta Davies reported a heated exchange she overheard during a casual conversation with the fintech expert. The expert had complained to Loretta about Caleb's reckless spending, saying Caleb was demanding too much cash up front and cutting corners on the legal paperwork. The expert was worried about covering his own tracks if Caleb got caught. Money makes people greedy, but fear makes them honest. I knew the expert was a potential weakness. The biggest crack, though, was between Caleb and his own father, Andrew. Andrew called me the day before the meeting, and his voice was tight, not with condescending pity, but with genuine anxiety. He told me he wasn't comfortable with the speed of the reorganization, and he kept asking if I was absolutely sure I was managing the foundation correctly. He was fishing for assurance, hoping I would confirm that his negligence was justified. I simply told him I was a woman of my word and that George's legacy was in secure hands. I didn't confirm whose hands, of course. His silence was deafening. He knew deep down what Caleb was doing, but he lacked the moral courage to stop it. He just wanted a way out without losing his future inheritance. This moment of discomfort from Andrew was my cue. Andrew wasn't a villain, he was a coward. Caleb and Brittany, however, were predators. The division between them was key. Andrew was vulnerable to shame. Caleb and Brittany were vulnerable to financial ruin. I planned the confrontation to hit both points. I made 3 arrangements. First, I arranged for Henry Albright, the real estate mogul, to be on standby. Second, I forwarded the complete digital evidence package to a separate law firm that George used decades ago, with instructions to release the files only when I gave them a specific code word during the meeting. Third, I asked Laura, my granddaughter who helped with the files, to be present. I told her I needed a friendly face, but the truth was, she was my living witness, a voice of the younger generation who could stand by my actions. I chose the precise moment for my move, right after Caleb would read the most damning part of the conservatorship petition. I wanted the look of triumph to be fully formed on his face before I wiped it away. They were counting on my age, my vulnerability, my confusion. As I dressed for the meeting, not in my soft cardigan, but in a tailored suit George always loved, I looked in the mirror. 82 years old. Every wrinkle, every silver hair was a memory, a battle scar, and a lesson learned. They were coming to end my authority. They were coming for my peace. Tomorrow they would learn that age brings wisdom, not weakness, and that I wasn't just guarding George's fortune, I was defending my soul. The Malibu house was strangely quiet that Friday afternoon. The air conditioning was humming, but the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Andrew, Caleb, Brittany, and my granddaughter Laura were all gathered in the main living room overlooking the Pacific, a view George and I spent half a lifetime earning. I arrived with my small handbag, carrying only my composure and my weapon, a discreetly placed tablet. Andrew began the meeting, his hands visibly shaking as he spoke about the need for family unity and the importance of protecting Mom. He kept saying he was doing this out of love. I just looked at him, remembering the emails where he complained about my stifling traditional ways. Then Caleb took over. He was polished, arrogant, wearing a smug mask of filial concern. He cleared his throat and began reading from a thick legal document, the petition for temporary conservatorship. He recited the specific points the doctor had noted, mentioning my difficulty with complex financial concepts and my supposed memory lapses. He even had the audacity to read the part that suggested I was delusional about the Elizabeth diamond necklace, claiming I was incapable of remembering where it was actually stored. He looked up from the document, catching my eye with that condescending, victorious gaze. He said, in a voice dripping with feigned sympathy, "Grandma, you've given us your best years. It's time to let us take care of this. The house, for instance, is currently depreciating, and we need to liquidate it for the foundation's sake." He was expecting me to nod vaguely and sign whatever he put in front of me. That was the moment, the peak of his arrogance. I stood up slowly, making sure my movement was deliberate and not frail. The room went silent. "Caleb," I interrupted him, my voice cutting through the tension, clear and cold. "The house is not depreciating." He looked genuinely confused. He tried to tell me that the recent market analysis he ordered showed the value dipping slightly. I smiled, a real smile this time, full of the wisdom he had so carelessly dismissed. I held up my tablet, the one he thought I barely knew how to turn on, and projected the screen onto the large living room wall. It was a digital image of a signed closing document. "In fact," I continued, allowing the silence to draw out as they all stared at the screen, "I concluded the sale of this very house last week, full cash price. The funds were immediately and irrevocably transferred to the Sarah Sterling Memorial Trust for the education of your cousins." The silence that followed was heavy, complete. Brittany's jaw dropped. Andrew's face turned white. Caleb stumbled back, dropping the legal papers he was holding, which scattered on the Persian rug. He kept whispering, "That's impossible. You can't." I didn't let him recover. The real betrayal needed to be exposed. I tapped the screen again, pulling up the next document, an authenticated bank transfer record. I also discovered, Caleb, that you attempted to secure a fraudulent $300 $100 personal loan by using the Elizabeth diamond necklace as collateral. He stammered, trying to deny it, claiming it was a misunderstanding and that he was just exploring options. I dismissed him with a gesture. The necklace, as a matter of fact, has been securely stored in the Sterling Foundation vault since I acquired it, not for an exhibition, as I told you, but precisely for security. It was never accessible to you for collateral, which you would have known if you weren't so impatient. Then came the definitive blow. I pulled up the log files Laura had helped me authenticate, the indisputable proof of his digital crime. This is a report from Loretta Davies detailing the precise attempts made by your fintech expert to breach the Foundation's accounts and redirect dividends using your shell companies. Andrew stared at his son, his face a portrait of shock and horror. Caleb lunged toward the table, desperate to grab the tablet, but I was faster. I spoke the code word, loud and clear, into the small recorder I held, the signal to the separate law firm. They saw a vulnerable old woman, I said, my voice rising with final, undeniable authority. They didn't see the woman who helped George build this empire, who understood the fine print, and who knew exactly how to use the modern systems he installed to protect it. The lawyer on the phone, receiving the signal, had already started the process. Caleb and Brittany were officially being investigated for fraud by the Foundation. The look on Caleb's face wasn't just shock. It was the dawning realization of complete, utter defeat, knowing his own foolish arrogance was his undoing. He stood there, stripped of his entitlement, silent, and defeated. The battle for the estate was over. The battle for my dignity was won. The meeting ended not with a bang, but with a choked silence. Caleb and Brittany were speechless, their ambition dissolving into panic. Andrew finally spoke, not to me, but to his son, his voice thick with shame, telling Caleb he had better find a lawyer immediately. I watched them leave my house, my former house, the weight of their betrayal finally lifted. Caleb and Brittany walked out defeated, their carefully constructed future in shambles. Andrew lingered, trying to apologize, muttering about his poor judgment and how he never fully believed Caleb, but didn't know how to stop it. I simply told him that negligence in the face of truth is still complicity, and that he would have to answer to George's legacy. He was quietly removed from the Foundation's board that evening. The consequences were swift and permanent. The Foundation, now acting with my digital evidence, pursued the fraud charges against Caleb and Brittany. They lost the little credibility they had, and their grand life in New York collapsed. I didn't revel in their destruction, but I felt a profound sense of justice. They wanted easy money. They got hard consequences. The final act of redefining my own legacy came with the disposition of the Malibu house funds. That money, that security George worked so hard for, was used to establish the George Sterling Women in STEM scholarship at his alma mater. A direct, clear statement. The Sterling wealth would be used to build new futures, not to bail out old entitlement. I also sat down with my lawyer and completely altered my will. Caleb and Brittany were permanently cut out. The inheritance was restructured to ensure that those who valued the family's principles, like my granddaughter Laura and Sarah's other children, would be the true inheritors of the Foundation, not just the fortune. You see, I lived long enough to understand that the greatest asset you possess isn't the stock portfolio or the real estate. It's the wisdom accumulated over 80+ years. They mistook my slowness for stupidity, my patience for weakness. They thought that because I preferred physical books to digital screens, I couldn't navigate their high-tech fraud. But I was taught by the best, and I remember every lesson. Now, at 82, I've started a new chapter. I still manage the foundation, but with a renewed purpose. I've taken up painting again, something I hadn't done since I was a young bride, and I now live a much simpler, more dignified life, free from the greedy whispers of ambition. This story, my story, is not just a tale of family drama, it's a quiet declaration. It's proof that no matter your age, you are not a burden. Your experience is your armor, and your intuition is your finest weapon. Respect is earned over a lifetime, and it is not something to be surrendered quietly when someone else tries to steal your dignity. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight to be seen and respected, I want to hear from you. Drop your city in the comments below. I'd love to know where this message of strength is reaching. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, because every grandmother has a tale that needs to be told, please subscribe to my channel. Let's keep sharing the wisdom that only comes with age. Thank you for listening to my truth. It's time to live the rest of my years with the peace George always wanted for me.